The verse that we've been using as a springboard verse, it says in Romans 15:4, tells us why stories from the Old Testament are included there. It gives us a sense for what we should walk away thinking or feeling. Here's what it says: everything was written in the past, was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. When we're walking on a path, sometimes it doesn't seem like we're going to arrive where we want us to arrive. God says we're going to arrive at a good place. He says He causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. But sometimes when we are walking on that path, we can't see how that's going to work out. We look at what we're experiencing, and that doesn't feel good, and we might look into the future and think that things are going to go from good to bad to worse. And we just don't know if it makes sense to continue to try to walk with God when it hasn't seemed to work well to this point. And there are stories in the Old Testament where people came into that same type of experience. They faced portions of their seasons of life that it didn't seem like it's going to work out, and yet it ended up working out long term. We come to a story like that, the story of Esther. The book of Esther is a really curious book in the Bible for a couple of reasons. Number one, the word God is never mentioned. God is not mentioned once in the book. But His fingerprints are everywhere, and that's why it's kind of a curious book. The story of Esther is set 100 years after the Babylonian exile. We talked about that last week, when the Babylonians conquered Israel, and Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were summoned to Babylon as part of that captivity. And we know the story, Daniel in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the flaming furnace. And God showed that even though He moved them out of Israel into Babylon, into a foreign country, that God is not a God who is limited geographically. So God's power is not limited to one place. Wherever God's people are, God's power shows up there. We see the story. What ended up happening in Babylon, the Babylonians were conquered 100 years after they took the Jews into captivity. Babylon was conquered by Persia and came under the control of Persia. When the Persians came to power, they bankrolled some Jews to return back to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall and the temple. That's Ezra and Nehemiah, because that's how the Persians did things. And it was not a bad place to be. There was religious freedom to a degree, and so a lot of Jews ended up staying in Persia when a number of their brothers and sisters went back to Israel to rebuild the wall, etc., etc. And the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. I'm going to show some images. It takes a little while, but let's kind of become familiar with the story of Esther. King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, was the most powerful man in the world. In the 3rd year of his reign, he invited the nobles and princes to a feast, which lasted 180 days. King Xerxes ruled over the empire of the Medes and Persians, which stretched out over 127 provinces from Ethiopia to India. Living in his empire were many Jews. After the feast, the king invited everyone at his palace in Susa to another feast which lasted 7 days. There were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with fine linen cord to silver rings. There were beds of silver and gold on pavements of red, blue, black, and white marble. It was opulent. Everyone drank from cups of gold. Queen Vashti gave a party for the women in another part of the palace. At the end of 7 days, the king, who was drunk, ordered his 7 servants to fetch Queen Vashti so that he could show off her beauty. But they reported back that the queen refused to join him. Not a good decision. The king was furious. His wise men advised him, saying, "The queen has not only insulted you, but everyone. She has set a bad example in not showing honor to her husband." The queen's life and estate was taken away from her. A law was made and read aloud throughout the land that all wives must honor and obey their husbands. Who would replace Vashti as queen? Search took place throughout the land for the most beautiful young woman, and they were brought to the palace under the supervision of Haggai, the king's servant. Working in the palace was a Jew named Mordecai. Mordecai had a cousin named Esther, whom he had brought up because her parents had died. Esther was a beautiful young girl and chosen to join the other contestants in the palace for 12 months of beauty treatments. Mordecai advised her not to tell anyone that she was a Jew. Of the many women chosen, Esther was the one the king loved most, and she was crowned as queen instead of Vashti. The feast was given in her honor, but she told no one that she was a Jew. A little while later, Mordecai was guarding the king's gate and overheard 2 servants, Bigthan and Teresh, plotting against the king. Mordecai immediately warned Esther of the plot, and she told the king. The 2 plotters were arrested, found guilty, and hung on a tree. Their plot was recorded in the Chronicles of the king's reign, where it was noted that Mordecai is the one who had uncovered the plot. The king promoted Haman above all the other princes to be the second most powerful man in the kingdom. All the servants working at the king's gate would bow to Haman when he entered. However, Mordecai would not bow before Haman or show him reverence. "Why do you break the king's command and not bow down and honor Haman?" servants asked. They knew Mordecai was a Jew. They kept asking him, but Mordecai would not listen to them. They reported the matter to Haman, who was furious to find Mordecai, the Jew, did not bow or revere him. Haman schemed to find a way to punish not only Mordecai, but his people, the Jews, also. Haman went to the king and said, "There are people living in the land who have their own laws and obey them rather than the king's commands. A law must be passed so they can be destroyed. I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's treasury to get this done." The king took off his signet ring, gave it to Haman. "Keep the money and do to these people what you think is best." The king's scribes were instructed to write a law that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews were to be attacked and killed and their possessions taken as plunder. The law was sealed with the king's ring. A law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed or altered. The new law was announced throughout the empire. When the Jews heard the law of the Medes and Persians to have them killed, they started weeping and wailing. Many put on sackcloth and ashes as a sign of mourning. When Mordecai heard of Haman's plan to kill the Jews, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went around the city wailing loudly and bitterly. When Esther heard about Mordecai's distress, she sent Hathach, one of the king's servants, with others with clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he refused to put them on. Hathach was sent again by Esther to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Mordecai gave Hathach the text of the new law and explained how much Haman had promised to pay into the treasury to destroy the Jews. He asked Hathach to tell Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him to save her people, the Jews. Hathach reported back to Esther, anyone who approaches the king's inner chamber without being summoned by the king is put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter to them and spares their life. Esther said, I have not been summoned by the king but 30 days. Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai. He sent her back this message. Don't think because you live in the palace, you alone of all Jews will escape. If you remain silent, the Jews will perish. Who knows? But that you have been chosen as queen to help us at this time. Esther sent a reply to Mordecai. Gather all the Jews in Susa to pray and fast for me. Don't eat for 3 days. I will pray and fast with you. And then I will go to the king, even though he has not summoned me. If I die, I die. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. When the king saw her, he was pleased and had held out his golden scepter to spare her life. What is your request? He asked. Even if you ask for up to half the kingdom, I will give it to you. I would like to invite the king and Haman to a special banquet I have prepared, Esther replied. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. What is your request? The king asked. I would like to invite the king and Haman to another banquet tomorrow. Then I will answer the king's question. Haman left the palace in a good mood. But when he saw that Mordecai had not bowed or shown him respect, he was full of rage. Haman went to his friends and Zeresh's wife and boasted to them about his great wealth, his many sons, and the ways the king had honored him. I have been invited to a banquet by the king and queen tomorrow, but I cannot be happy while Mordecai the Jew is sitting at the king's gate. His wife and friends had an idea. Have a pole set up, and in the morning, ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. The suggestion delighted Haman, and he erected a pole that was 75 feet high. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles of his reign to be brought in and read to him. When the king read how Mordecai had exposed the plot to kill him, he asked what honor was given to Mordecai for doing this. The attendants replied, nothing has been done. Who is in the royal court? The king asked. Haman is standing in the court, they replied. He had come to ask for Mordecai to be executed. Bring Haman in, the king ordered. The king asked Haman, what should be done for a man the king wants to honor? Thinking that the king wanted to honor him, Haman replied, put the man in a royal robe the king has worn and on a horse the king has ridden. Then get the king's most noble prince to lead the horse through the city proclaiming, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." King said, "Go at once and get the robe and horse, and then do as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate. Do not neglect any detail." So Haman had to robe Mordecai, put him on a horse, lead him through the city, proclaiming, "This is what is done for the man the king honors." A humiliated Haman rushed home in grief and reported what had happened to his wife and friends. "Since Mordecai the Jew has begun your downfall, you cannot stand against him," they replied. "You will come to ruin." At that moment, the king's servant arrived to take Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared for him and the king. Haman was summoned to attend the banquet Queen Esther had prepared for him and the king. As they were drinking wine, the king asked, "What is your request? Even if it is half my kingdom, it will be granted." "My request is that you save my life and the lives of my people," Esther replied. "We are to be destroyed." "Who has dared to threaten your life?" the king demanded to know. "An enemy," replied Esther. "This vile Haman. He is having a no good, awful, very bad day at this point." Haman looked terrified. The king got up in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman started begging Esther to save his life. The king returned to find Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Guards were called to seize Haman. One of the king's attendants reported, "Haman has erected a pole by his house. He was planning to impale Mordecai on it." "Impale Haman on it," the king ordered. Haman was let out to be executed. Then the king's fury subsided. That day the king gave Esther Haman's estate. Esther told the king she was related to Mordecai. The king gave Mordecai Haman's signet ring, and Esther appointed him to look after Haman's riches and possessions. Esther fell at the king's feet, weeping and begging him to put a stop to the evil plan to kill the Jews. "If it pleases the king, let an order be written overruling Haman's plan. As Haman threatened the Jews, I have impaled him on the pole he set up and given his estate to Esther." The kingdom replied, "Write another decree in my name and sealed with my signet ring. No document written in my name can be changed." The royal secretaries were summoned. A new law was written giving the Jews the right to gather and defend themselves if anyone attacked them. They could also plunder the property of their enemies. Copies of the new law were sent out through the 120 provinces of the empire. Everyone knew the Jews would be ready and waiting if anyone attacked them on the 13th day of the 12th month. When Mordecai left the palace, he was wearing a royal purple robe and crown. The Jews celebrated the news, and their enemies became afraid of them. The 13th day of the 12th month was the date the enemies of the Jews hoped to destroy them. The Jews gathered to defend themselves, helped by the governors and nobles of the provinces. Any group who attacked them was struck down and killed. In the capital city of Susa, Haman's 10 sons and another 500 men who hated the Jews were destroyed. But the Jews did not plunder their belongings. Permission was given to the Jews to continue dealing with their enemies the next day also. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews asking them to celebrate this victory every year on the 14th and 15th days of the 12 months. Haman had plotted and cast a lot known as a pur to destroy the Jews, so the celebration was called the Feast of Purim. It was a day of feasting and joy. People gave presents to each other. The Jews have kept this custom every year through every generation to this very day. See a couple things as we kind of think about what the story says. We see a couple things. Really, one thing that stands out, I think, with Esther, and then we'll talk briefly about a couple things that have God's fingerprints on them. Esther's wisdom. She takes careful, thoughtful steps. When she finds herself in trouble, she does a couple of good things. Number one, she seems to pause. And that's a good strategy. There's a verse, interesting verse, Proverbs. Through patience, a ruler can be persuaded, and a gentle tongue can break a bone. A gentle tongue is delicate, soft. A gentle tongue can break a bone, and by perseverance has the idea of length. It's something that is long-term, not short-term. And what the proverb indicates is a long-term plan, gently approached, is able to accomplish something that a quick reactive plan cannot. And even in that case, gentle wisdom. And that seems to be what characterizes wisdom in the Bible. It's not reactive, it's responsive. It doesn't lose its head, it's measured. Somebody who's wise in the Bible thinks before they act. They look at their situation. They talk to other people. They think about what to do. That's a wise approach, and not one that we can take by ourselves. I'm going to show you what it says in Esther 4. This is how Mordecai, her relative and a fellow Jew, responded when he heard that Esther was contemplating going to the king, but a little bit frightened because 30 days had passed and the king hadn't summoned her, so she was putting her life in her hands. Here's how Mordecai responded. There is a wisdom here. Try to find it. Here's what he says. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. We'll look at the response. But Mordecai is not reactive. He's not fuming. He trusts that God is going to accomplish relief, is going to come in deliverance, and what he does, he asks her a question, who knows, but that you have been put in royal position for such a time as this. What ends up striking me is somebody who ends up responding wisely has been listening to wise counsel. Because of Esther's relationship with Mordecai, because she was hearing wise words, she was able to use wisdom in dealing with her situation. You've heard the saying, it's the acronym GIGO, G-I-G-O. You know what that means? Garbage in, garbage out. If you get bad information in, and if that's what you harbor, it's going to end up coming out. Let's make another thing, not gigo, but weewo. Wisdom in, wisdom out. Who do you know that's wise in a godly way? Think about the person. See some of you smiling. There's somebody who, when you talk to them, they'll give you measured response. Listen. They'll think carefully. They won't be reactive. A wise person tunes in wise as friends. And a wise person watches the information that they are getting into their mind. They They are cautious about continuing to subject themselves to stuff that is inflammatory and reactive, because garbage in, garbage out. And therefore, it's what we find with Esther is she's careful. When she gets in a fix, she knows who to turn to. So I'll ask you, if you're in a fix and you don't know how to proceed, is there a person you turn to? Who is that person? If you don't have one, let me encourage you to think about a person like that. All of us in life are going to face difficult things. If you come into a difficult situation that is not easy to solve, who could you turn to who won't be reactive, who will listen carefully and thoughtfully, and give you advice that would be sound but quiet? We learned something about Esther. We also, briefly, we learn a couple of things about God. Here's what this: God's promises are irrevocable. Let me tell you what irrevocable means. It means that they can't be revoked. When God makes a promise to do something, he doesn't revoke it. He doesn't say, oh, I made a promise, but I didn't know that was going to happen, so I'm taking the promise back. And we find that there are some, and we could talk about Jews. God made a promise to the Jews through Abraham, and this is what he said: through your children, all mankind will be blessed. So God made a promise that through the children of Abraham, the Jews, God would bless mankind. There is a theology, though, that some believe that because Jews crucified Christ, that he has taken that promise away from Jews and has given it to others, that God has kind of benched the Jews. That's not what Paul indicates here. Look what it says. Again, this is a long passage. We're not going to spend a long time. Intriguing passage, though, from Romans 11. It says, Paul writes, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. Let me tell you what that means. It doesn't mean every single Israelite will be saved, but what it is saying that there are two portions of Israel. There's a northern portion that existed at the time after Solomon, and the kingdom was divided in half, and the northern part was called the House of Israel, and it was populated by Galileans. The southern part is the house of Judah. That's populated by Judeans. Galileans in the north, Judeans in the south. The house of Israel in the north. Jeroboam was their king. Nightmare rulers. They are not spiritual purebreds. The ones in the south have great kings. David, Hezekiah, and so they were the ones who seemed to be the ones poised to be the ones that God would choose, because God did say, I am going to send the Messiah at some day. And I'm going to send him into the world. And whereas people have represented me prior to the Messiah coming, when he comes, he's going to reveal me in a way I have never been revealed. We talk about the difference between analog and digital. You know, you have an analog, you can't have an analog TV anymore. You can see an image, but it's not crisp and sharp. It's not clear. Digital is more clear. Prior to Jesus, we learned some things about God from the Old Testament, but they're not clear. They're fuzzy. God's character is not sharply defined. When Jesus comes, though, now, we can see what God likes and what God doesn't like. We can see what makes God angry and what makes God happy. We know God better because Jesus reveals him to us. What God does is he made promises to the Jews, and it says that he hardened part of Israel. He hardened the ones in the south, the Judeans. They were the ones responsible to have Jesus crucified. And they were hardened so that they would do it. It wasn't God's purpose that his son would live, but that he would die. What ended up happening, the Judeans in the south, they were the ones who didn't believe the gospel. They didn't accept it. The ones in the north, all the disciples were Galileans. All the disciples were Galileans. They were the ones from the north. The ones who didn't, they weren't spiritual purebreds. In fact, we've said this before, there was only one disciple who was from the south. Just one. One of the 12. And who was that? Judas Iscariot. The one who just couldn't buy it. He just couldn't get it. And he wasn't supposed to. What God's done, and this is, what God did, he did this so that the Judeans in the south hated the fact that the Galileans in the north believed in Jesus. And so they booted the Galileans out of the country. And where did he boot them? Into the Roman Empire. You know why he booted them into the Roman Empire? So 2,000 years later, we could talk about this message. So that's what God's promises are irrevocable. Look what it goes on to say. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godliness away from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. For God's gift and his call are irrevocable. What it says, when God makes a promise, he doesn't break it. We don't know about what's going to happen over the next couple of years. I don't know. I will tell you what's going to occur at one point. The next step in salvation history, that Jews are going to understand that Christ was the Messiah. It's going to happen. That's going to happen when the time of the Gentiles is over. Right now, what God is doing, waving Gentiles, non-Jews, into his kingdom. And he's putting a red light to Jews, not allowing them to see who Jesus was. Some might see, but not many. At some point in the future, God's going to put a red light to Gentiles. Our time will be over. And he's going to put a green light to Jews, and they're going to see what they've never been able to see before. You know why God does that? He doesn't wash his hands of people. When he makes promises, he keeps them. He keeps his promises to the Jews. He keeps his promises to us. And you know what he says? To those who hear the word and believe him who sent, we have eternal life. And we won't be judged, but we pass from death to life. Here's the promise. If you hear Jesus' words and believe that God sent him, you have eternal life. You won't be judged. You have passed from death to life. How do you know that that promise is going to be true? Because when God makes promises, he doesn't revoke them. He keeps them. God's promises are irrevocable. And his purposes are inscrutable. Inscrutable means we just can't. God functions on a level that is so above us. I'm just going to read a verse, and it says, in fact, I'm not going to read this verse because it's very confusing. Here's what it says. I'll let you know what it says. God has bound all men over to disobedience. What it means, God makes everyone feel like an outie. You know the difference between innies and outies? Innies, they believe that they belong. Outies, they don't think they belong. What it says, God makes everyone feel like an outie. so that the only way they can become an innie is by his mercy. Let's say, Beth, you feel like an outie. Let's say she doesn't feel like an outie. But if she did feel like an outie, God invites merit-based outies to become mercy-based innies. Let's say, Beth, she has behaviors that she doesn't think that God likes, and she might feel like an outie. She might think, well, God's never going to accept me because I don't do this, and I don't do that, and I don't spend time in the Bible, and I don't give, and I don't, and I don't, and I don't. So what God does, he makes everyone feel like an outie so that when he extends his hand, it's not a paycheck. It's a gift. It's mercy. So what he does, he extends mercy. And he says, if you believe in my Son and believe that I sent him, you will have eternal life. You will not be judged, but you will pass from death to life. This is an offer to you, and it's based in mercy. And if you take my hand, you take my hand not to receive a paycheck, but to receive a gift bestowed by mercy. That's the way, that salvation is always a gift with the mercy of God behind it. What do we do with this? A couple of things. Reflect on God's greatness. God is going to accomplish his purposes. Here's what this verse says. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. God is going to accomplish his purposes in the end. His purposes are inscrutable. You can't figure them out, but they're really good. Reflect on God's greatness. Reflect on his goodness. Here's what he says. Keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. You will not come to a place in your life where you're in harm's way and I'm going to distance from you. God always keeps his promises. Let's stand for closing prayer. God, thanks for your purposes and promises. Thanks for the fact that you can be trusted. As we figure that out, little by little, helps us to be wise. I pray that you would help us find, we don't have those wise people who believe you and who listen and who help us make wise decisions. In Jesus' name, amen.